Hello, everybody. I hope my guests doesn't need any introduction. You all probably know Redeemed Zoomer. You probably know me. What we're going to be talking about today is there's two aspects, I think, of traditional Christian belief that are really important to Christians, that have always been important to Christians. One of them is the propositional statements of the faith. So, a good example of this would be the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all of the creeds that come out of the early church and then eventually the Reformation. But on the other side, just as important to lots of Christians, especially to traditional Christians, and in that I would include, say, ecclesialists, but also the classical Protestant reformers, was the actual lived out faith, how it looked to actually be a Christian, the liturgy, the principles of worship. The example I always give is at the time of the Reformation, there were people arguing about the normative principle of worship or the regulative principle of worship. But neither of them were making the argument that the way we worship doesn't matter and you can just kind of do it however you want. They either thought we should receive this from the tradition or we should faithfully adhere to the best as we are able to the way the Bible portrays worship and kind of build it from the ground up again. So it's always been an important part of all branches of traditional Christianity.
Yeah, so thank you for having me on the show. I'm Redeemed Zoomer. For those of you who don't know me, I am a Presbyterian, which means I do hold to that evil regulative principle of worship. Just to clarify, we don't try to build worship from the ground up. We simply give the axe to any worship practice that is not in Scripture. But if it is in Scripture, we just keep the way that people did it. Anyway.
Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. I think, there's probably different ways also of hashing out the regulative principle of worship. But I think that's a good way of putting it, that you kind of can still receive the tradition as it is, but unless you can't go to Scripture and say, here's why we do that thing we received in the tradition, you kind of have to get rid of it. Versus in the normative principle of worship, it would basically be like, as long as Scripture doesn't exclude this element of worship that we've been doing, as long as it doesn't say, don't do that, then you don't have to get rid of it.
Yeah, like the Bible doesn't say you can't do a mass dedicated to blessing your dogs and cats. But Presbyterians don't do that because there's no precedent in Scripture for doing that. And of course, there's different applications of the regulative principle. That's why the regulative principle is a principle, not a doctrine. So of course, my application of it would be a lot more loose than like a Scottish Covenanter, even though they are really based. Anyway, so
I got in trouble on Twitter for saying that someone said that John MacArthur follows the normative principle of worship, but the normative principle of worship would also exclude the mass for your dog because there's no tradition of doing masses for dogs there's no norm to inherit, to preserve either. So the normative principle of worship also isn't, and this is kind of what we're going to get into today, but it also isn't the idea that you can just do whatever makes you happy in worship. The idea is actually you are beholden to, in both circumstances, you're beholden to an authority that is greater than the whims of the congregation.
Yeah. Anyway, so today we're talking about participatory versus propositional belonging to Christianity, more particularly belonging to a Christian tradition like Anglican or Presbyterian or Lutheran. And I think this is one of the biggest debates in church history. It was on Instagram in summer 2024. When we had a lot of people claiming not just to agree with Anglicanism, but to be Anglican without setting foot in an Anglican church. These were non-denominationals and people in PCA churches who got convinced of bishops yesterday and then started calling themselves Anglican. And, it wasn't just assent to the fact that Anglicanism is true. They were doing things like praying the daily office or whatever you guys do on their own. They were, reading the Book of Common Prayer, but they did not attend Anglican churches. And they made very, very good excuses for Anglican churches. Their mommy didn't want to drive them, just the way a lot of Christians in China will be killed if they go to church, but they still travel 200 miles to do so. But if your mommy won't give you a ride, then that's definitely an excuse not to go. And there's definitely nobody from the church who will give you a ride if you reach out to them.
I think that's very true. I think it's, for whatever reason, Anglicanism is very susceptible to this. I think partially because just also in general, Anglicanism tends to be a halfway house for people exploring theology in
Mhm.
general, because there's a breadth that's allowed in Anglicanism, but also because it's kind of like, we've got bishops. So if you got convinced of this one thing from Catholic apologetics, but if you got convinced of this one thing from Protestant, apologetics,
Yeah,
so
but
people don't
no,
actually, yeah. I
I
would
see
say I know
working.
lots of people who barely ever actually even went to an Anglican church, who eventually just became Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or something else. And then they talk about how Anglicanism is crazy. And it's like, well, did you actually ever go to an Anglican church? It's like, well, no, but I was in a group chat, or I was on a Discord with Anglicans for 3 weeks. So I'm basically an expert on Anglicanism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not just Anglicans. In the Reformed tradition, we have a lot of LARPers. I think on the Reformed internet today, in popular Reformed circles, there's more Reformed LARPers than Reformed people, because I think every Reformed Baptist is a LARPer. Because here's the thing, so it used to be that Reformed Baptist was just if you agree with predestination, if you're a tulipist, you're Reformed. And now we've raised the bar a little bit. Now that there's like the 4 C's, I don't know who invented that. It was definitely not Calvin, but it was
Mhm.
like if you're confessional and covenantal and something something, then you can be
Yeah.
Reformed, because just all these propositions or whatever. But
Yeah.
that's even if you have all the propositions, even if you assent to the entire system of Calvin's institutes, it wouldn't make you Reformed, because you're not participating in the stream of Christianity that is the Reformed tradition. So I think
Yeah.
it's more than that. And even among people who claim to be like Dutch Reformed, there's people who make like a Mr. Potato Head of Reformed doctrines. Well, like they say they're, I don't know, a Reformed Luxembourgish Episcopalian, and they attend their parents' non denominational church.
Yeah.
So participation and proposition are both necessary. That's why I would say a uh, heretical PCUSA lesbian priestess or pastor, we don't have priests, a heretical PCUSA pastor is more Presbyterian than a Reformed Baptist. Is sorry, more Reformed than a Reformed Baptist. Because the Reformed Baptists don't have the propositional or the participatory. This heretical PCUSA pastor at least has the participatory, just not the propositional.
Um, I would probably agree, kind of agree. Here's what I would say. I think there's an unfortunate. I think the original thing that started the conversation with us was I was on Isaiah Long's channel, and we were talking about the split between the mainline and the evangelical world. And in general, the evangelical world tends to overemphasize just the propositional parts of Christianity and
Mm-hmm.
ignore the participatory parts of Christianity. And the
Yep.
problem is that the reverse is true in the mainline. There's people who are very participatory but not very propositional. If
Absolutely.
you've ever been to like an Episcopal parish with like a bunch of boomers, they're very like particular about which rite in the BCP that they're going to use, and is it rite 1 or rite 2, and they have like all of the little parts of the liturgy memorized. And then if you ask them like, okay, well, what was Thomas Cranmer's doctrine of the Lord's Supper? They're like, I've never thought about that my entire life, and I don't really care. And they're not very strict on keeping the theological orthodoxy in the denomination.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on, I want to acknowledge at least the super chat. Thank you for the £5. And next time, I swear that me and Redeem Zoomer do the live stream, I will wear a bow tie. I don't have a bow tie.
Now, hang on. That's cultural appropriation. According to Keith Foskey, the Pope of denominational stereotypes, Presbyterians wear bow ties.
True.
Um,
I guess what do Anglicans wear? Cravats or something like aggressively British? Or
yeah.
I don't know.
So no, if anyone who's not Presbyterian wears a bow tie, it's cultural appropriation. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. I'll leave that to you guys. So
Mhm.
I think part of the origin of this divide, which again, really people want to like malign Protestantism for stuff that's just particular to American culture, which has since been exported. But I would basically say like up until the 1700s, 1800s, there really wasn't this divide in
Correct.
participatory or propositional faith in any Christian faith. The idea was if you wanted to seriously consider yourself, say, Dutch Reformed, it was because you were in the Netherlands and you participated in Dutch everything and were Dutch Reformed. And I imagine part of this has to do with the kind of like immigrantization of the churches into America, where like in the old world there was everyone around you is your same denomination, if that makes sense. Like you're not thinking about it even. Everyone in Scotland was Presbyterian. Everyone in England was Anglican, except for some of the dissenters, I guess. In France, you're all Catholic. In the Netherlands, you're all Dutch Reformed. But once you come to America, there's an element of like, there's the church down the street that's Dutch Reformed and the Baptist church and the this. And so what makes them all their own thing? And I think you can give one answer or another answer. And I think the evangelical answer to that question in the American context was, here's all the stuff we believe. And more broadly, the like conservative Christian response at the time was, here's all the stuff we believe. Versus over time, I think as people started to identify their heritage, and because the denominational associations were so important to heritage in the United States, that as time went on, people wanted to be able to keep the participating in the things that made them feel distinct culturally, but they didn't. But they were still assimilating into American assumptions and propositions, if that makes sense. And so that's when you kind of get the over time drift of the mainlines away from the propositions of their denominations, but still wanting to hold on in some sense to the traditions, the lived out embodied traditions. And I would even say that those traditions often have consequences in like the distinct cultures of the different, seven sisters of the mainline. So like Episcopalians still tend to have this kind of like hoity-toity attitude in a lot of ways. Older Episcopalians that I know, they tend to be more kind of elitist naturally. Even if they're liberal, they're very elitist. And part of that, I think, kind of is associated with our tradition as like a more hierarchical denomination, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Do you agree with this assessment? Do you disagree with that assessment?
I feel like I disagree with the assessment. Like you're a genius in coming up with this distinction and explaining mainline and evangelical in terms of this. Like that's all you. But I'm not sure if that's the origin, because even in America, for most of American history, we still didn't see this divide between participatory and propositional Christianity. It's a very recent development. And in the rest of the world, we are seeing the same divide in Protestant churches today. Like even within the Church of Scotland and the Church of England, the more conservative parishes are more contemporary and more evangelical, broadly speaking. So it's a universal divide. I think it can be traced back to the fundamentalist modernist controversy. The churches, all the mainline churches started to drift theologically liberal. And the mainline institutions have always been good at preserving the participatory aspect all across the board. That's why there's not a single mainline Protestant institution that has drifted from its participatory aspect at all. But there was basically a fundamentalist movement in every major denomination. And the fundamentalists, based on the definition, they care about the fundamentals. They care about the essentials. They don't really care about the non-essentials. So they just want to take their doctrines and run. That's what the Orthodox Presbyterian Church did. They want to take the doctrines and run. They saw an underemphasis on the propositional aspect of the faith. So they took that and ran with it. And, they were thinking, like a lot of them thought Jesus was about to come back. They weren't really thinking about preserving all the music and architecture and little cultural details and Marge's potluck recipes from their old churches. They were just thinking about preserving the doctrines. So lo and behold, now we have basically two types of Protestant churches, ones that are traditional outwardly but not inwardly, and ones that are traditional inwardly but not outwardly.
Yeah. Interesting to kind of try to map this onto the Anglican history in the United States. What I think is, it's because of how centered our tradition is on the liturgy and the aesthetics. Our fundamentalists that split, there's like two. There's like the REC and then there's like the continuing Anglicans. But both of them actually were very like particular about the service still and the aesthetics. It wasn't until the ACNA split that you get this emphasis on the propositions and then saying, yeah, but we can have contemporary worship and we can do all this other stuff, and ignoring, and we can meet in a Pizza Hut or whatever.
Well, even in like the REC and those like continuing Anglican micro denominations, I still don't see all the Episcopalian cultural connotations. Like being a hoity-toity elitist who sends their kids to like a super rich private school, That's part of the Episcopalian heritage, and it's
Yeah.
good, and it should be celebrated. I don't really see that in REC. I don't see like the
Yeah.
tiny Anglo-Catholic micro-denomination having, rich kid private schools everywhere. I just don't see that.
Yeah. Although
So,
as far as I understand, I think that the continuing, so there's like the Anglican joint synods are starting like boarding schools. There's a boarding school called like St. Dunstan's they're opening up in the Virginias or something, or in the Carolinas or whatever. So they're
yeah,
trying to bring it back. But I think also it's almost impossible to like retain. Something else I've noticed is it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people in those micro denominations who were born in them. If that makes sense, right? So like
yeah,
there are lots of people who are very staunch, continuing Anglicans, or even, I mean, ACNA is not even old enough to really have lots of people born in it, but like most of them were like, oh yeah, I was raised Baptist, or I was raised PCA, I was raised whatever, and then I became a continuing Anglican. I don't really meet a lot of cradle continuing
yeah.
Anglicans
And I think,
because, yeah, when you're so small and you don't like geographically reserve some portion of the country for yourself, if that makes sense. Like say like the OPC is very centered in Pennsylvania, from what I understand. Like there's a lot of Philadelphia churches. I've seen them
yeah,
just being in Pennsylvania.
yeah.
Um,
I
so
think I think
yeah,
part of participatory Christianity is belonging to an old institution, is being in the same church as your ancestors, both spiritual and physical. Like
yeah,
in the Northeast, all churches have like cemeteries, right?
yeah,
It used to be very normal to go to the same church as your great great grandfather, and I think in a stable society that will be the norm. Like, yeah, if you were not born and raised in the church, you got to convert to something. You can't magically make your ancestors, you can't be a Mormon and baptize your dead ancestors. But I
hmm
think in a good society, most people will stay in the church of their ancestors.
yeah,
That's kind of the way it's been for most of history. So that
yeah,
is actually part of participatory Christianity. So even in
yes,
Anglican fundamentalist denominations
yeah,
where liturgy is a fundamental, there's other things that are not fundamentals,
yeah,
such as having all that, heritage and cemeteries, all that.
yeah. I think, and this gets into why participatory faith is important. I mean, the stream is called "Why You Have to Go to Church." Part of
Mm-hmm.
it is, I think, we are so used to thinking of ourselves. I think this is a kind of, I would contend for the idea that this is a kind of American assumption of how intellectualized we get with what we, the reason I believe what I believe is because I was convinced of it, is what most people think. But
Nope.
a lot of times we live out certain things being true, and because we're living as if that thing is true, we start to believe that that thing is true. Like so many people, I know lots of pastors or priests who will talk about, like, they'll have some high schooler or college student come to them and they're like, oh, I'm questioning the faith. And then they're like, okay, you know, did you have fornication? Like, did you, sleep with somebody when you shouldn't have? And most of the time they're like, how did you know? And it's like, well, basically, you started doubting all of these things because you're living as if it wasn't true already. And
Mm-hmm.
so it would be easier to back up your lifestyle. So when you don't have a denomination that's like in the entire country, you move around, even if you have this kind of sentimentality about the way you were raised, yada, 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 it's just not going to live itself out in your life and you're going to stop believing it. It's going to stop being as important to you. I
Yeah.
mean,
That that
as far as
is
as far as I
that's
understand, maybe, sorry.
sorry, you go.
As far as I understand, I think the Seven Sisters of the Main Line and Roman Catholicism are probably the only denominations that have like zip code coverage. If you've ever heard
Mhm.
that, like
Yes.
every zip code has a church of this denomination. I know that in the ACNA, the reason that the church planting fervor is because we're so used to being Episcopalians, and so they want to be able to do that. But you know, whatever, it's not. It takes a lot of resources to do that practically.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to keep somebody in their entire life in this systemic culture is difficult. Eastern Orthodoxy actually does have the same problem where they don't have zip code coverage, and people who are raised Eastern Orthodox actually have similar, um, you know, cultural Christianity problems to mainline Christians in lots of ways, and it's
Mm-hmm.
they just end up leaving the church though because Eastern Orthodoxy doctrinally is so rigid that they're not going to be able to move the institutions in the same way that the Protestants do. But
Yeah.
even Mormons are very like this, where they have to keep you, in the participatory Mormon, Utah culture, whatever. You have to go to this university, you have to do all this to stay culturally Mormon or whatever it is. Even
Yeah.
if you lose the propositions, people still won't give up the identity. I would
Yeah.
say, yeah,
I
lots of religions
also
are like this, needless to say. Yeah.
I think it's extremely true that, what you believe intellectually is super connected to what you're actually doing in your life.
Yeah.
Anytime someone tells me I like I'm struggling with my faith. Like I get a lot of messages, people acting like I'm their pastor. I'm not. That's why they need to have a real pastor and
Yeah.
participatory Christianity, go to church. But a lot of times people say, I'm really struggling with my faith. I don't know what to do. What should I do? I ask, do you attend church weekly? And 9 out of 10 times the answer is no. And when it is yes, they go to some really crazy non-denominational Pentecostal church that's very anti-intellectual.
Yeah.
So it's the same as if a kid goes to college, comes back, says, I'm doubting the faith. You ask, who are you sleeping with? It's probably someone.
Yeah.
It's probably
Yes.
someone. And I think most people who are unconvinced intellectually of the claims of Protestantism have never participated in a historic Protestant church. Usually they were raised Baptist or non denominational, and they stop in like Presbyterian or Anglican, but generally that's it's not propositional and participatory at the same time. Usually Lutheranism more likely. They have the LCMS, and that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And generally, there's a reason most people who convert away from Protestantism, like were Protestant and go to Rome or the East, came from very low church Protestantism. It's very rare you have like cradle Presbyterians just converting like that.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I think that's part of that is when you're in a non-denominational setting, they try so much actually intentionally to get rid of the elements of participatory anything. So like my favorite thing is there's like a trend in Baptist churches to get rid of the word Baptist even in churches. So they don't want the sign because people get offended by the term Baptist, I guess, because they're associated with like, I don't know, Westboro Baptist or whatever. So they try to, for the sake of evangelism, drop the name. But then you end up creating this ambiguity about even what this church is teaching. And then you say, okay, this is just a community church. Well, why do they have the beliefs that they have? And they don't
Yeah,
even connect you to any tradition, even the Baptist tradition. It doesn't go that far back. So
yeah,
if somebody in the church says, hey, I'm starting to have questions about, I don't know, this or that doctrine, or where does the Bible teach this or whatever, which it would be extremely rare, right? Unless the one pastor at your church knows the answer to every single question anyone in the parish could ever think of, okay? Or they probably wouldn't call it a parish, right? Could ever think of. They're gonna get to a point where they run up into a barrier unless they're hooked up into a deeper tradition that has a longer time span of answering questions than the one pastor at this church. And the difference is when you emphasize tradition as much as Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy do, you inherently expect you have to plug into this bigger network of theologians to get answers from them. But the same thing is true about Protestant Christianity. There
yeah.
is the same network of theologians that have answered all these questions, yada yada yada.
And just to my do my one trick pony thing over here and connect this to Reconquista somehow. I don't think you can have that network of theologians if you're not in the main line, because the main line has not just physical, well, it is physical because it's like books in a library, but not just monetary and aesthetic resources, but also intellectual resources as well. Even with things like PRDL, like digital libraries, even though information is a lot easier to access now than it used to be, most times you don't even know what to look for. When you go to mainline Protestant libraries, like seminary libraries, then compare them to evangelical seminary libraries, the disparity is astounding. They have things, tons and tons of things in every shelf that an evangelical library wouldn't even think to add. Like the church debates in the Methodist Episcopal Church in Oklahoma between 1850 and 1860, and you'll have a lot of obscure theological debates going on there.
Yeah.
Or like I just found this thick volume, like this big, in my library on American Presbyterian sacramentology in the 20th century. You don't really see that in these evangelical churches.
Yeah.
So I really believe the reason Catholics and Orthodox are beating us at every corner in online apologetics is because they have a larger network of theologians to appeal to. Now, they also have more money to fund apologists. I don't know how many paid Presbyterian apologists there are. I don't know how many paid Presbyterian apologetics ministries there are, but
Which is
they
so sad.
have, yeah, they have way more resources. They have way more resources at their disposal. I think it's resources that even PCA and ACNA churches don't really have as much of. There's a reason that your average PCA pastor will assent to the Reformed tradition, but be very uneducated on the Reformed tradition and not know that baptism saves. Your average PCA pastor hasn't read the Scots Confession. And I know that because whenever a PCA pastor says baptism doesn't save, it's just a sign and a seal, I ask them that, and the answer is usually no. How do you be a Presbyterian and not read John Knox? Seriously. And most PCUSA pastors are perfectly educated on the Reformed view of the sacraments. They just don't assent to it, but they know what it is. So
Yeah.
this is a very good example of participatory versus propositional.
Yeah. And I think actually even the emphasis shows up, in my opinion, in the pastoral styles. Like the idea that I think in my personal experience and just generally the vibes that I get, the goal of the PCA pastor or the ACNA pastor or even an LCMS pastor, I would say, when they get new people, is they are focused on catechesis. But what catechesis is often is trying to make sure that the people in the pews know intellectually a bunch of facts about what they have to believe.
Yeah.
And they'll go through whatever their church's catechism is. Um, you know, I have mixed feelings about the ACNA catechism because it does try to do literally everything. It does try to unload every single propositional element of Christianity onto the people who read it. But it's just it's a huge catechism as opposed to, like, say, the Heidelberg, which you can go through way faster. But it's the same thing. It's just literally unloading propositions onto Christians, which is important. That's the next thing. I think actually there's a parallel, and to some extent, with the Protestant Reformation, because before the Protestant Reformation, most people who went to church, including clergy, didn't even know what they were saying in the service, and they didn't know anything. They just were doing it. They were just participating. They weren't propositional anyway. And so an emphasis of the Protestant Reformation was, hey, actually, we should teach the people in the pews what this is all about, and explain it. And so that was important. But what's happened now in a weird way is like an anti, it's the opposite of that situation, I think, in a lot of ways, that they had the Protestant Reformation, where people were more used to propositions. Like, if you ask the average person who is not a Christian, what do Christians believe? They probably could say they think that God killed his son to save us from our sins thing. Like that part they would get. But if they walked into a service and you said, say they don't have any history or background in Christianity, they would be like, what is the bread and the wine? What are they doing up there? Why are they calling it Jesus? Versus if you ask like a peasant in the 1500s what they know about the service, they would be like, oh, I know that we have to say all this stuff in Latin and do all this whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then if you ask them about the atonement, they'd be like, the what, man? You know what I mean? So,
and just for all the Caths and Orthos, they are in denial of this, but they have been massively influenced by Protestantism. Most, Catholic and Orthos online are lay people, and they're pretty well trained in their own tradition's theology. The idea that you would have a lot of lay people, not monks or nuns or priests, very trained in theology, that is very Protestant.
Yeah.
And, I see my mom's Catholic priest does a Bible study, and he's good at it. It's a good parish. But Protestants invented a Bible study. So the idea that the participatory aspect of the faith would even reach the lay people at all, that's a Protestant idea. I mean, obviously that was the case in the early church, but as the church got more systematized and institutionalized, that just sort of disappeared. And the Reformation was trying to bring that back.
Yeah. Yeah. An interesting point I wanted to bring up earlier is you talked about like cemeteries.
Yeah.
So there's probably some irony in this as well, but I know you just got married. I think you got married at a PCA church. I got married in an Episcopal church, actually, because my wife's family are generational Episcopalians. And so they have a parish that they've been going to for a long time. We know the priest, he's fairly conservative. And they have like ancestors literally buried in that cemetery. The parish goes back to like the 1600s
Wow.
in Maryland. So that's where we got married. But I've been in like the parish hall and I've talked to all the people there and everything. And you're right. There are literally manuals about random things in this one parish's history and then this community's history that go back like hundreds of years. And you can read about the people and all this stuff. And in a way, it's actually kind of beautiful just realizing like, oh, wait, this random guy who was the church warden in the 1800s, who history is otherwise totally forgotten. Well, this church has actually preserved his memory, till now. And so by going to that church, you actually do feel connected to that person. And I think what that does is it instills a kind of responsibility feeling, or at least it should instill a kind of feeling of responsibility.
Yeah.
Because, we've disagreed on Reconquista, and we can probably talk about that in this video too, but like it should at least pain, no matter how, much you disagree with the concept of Reconquista, it should still pain you that like, wait, look at all these people who put in all these resources, who actually built these institutions, who would be violently opposed to the people who actually run the institutions now. And you just have to read these people and what they thought and what they believed and what they thought was important to be kind of like your gut should churn when you realize, hold on, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the 1800s said what? And the presiding bishop today says what? And trying to compare what's happened to these denominations. It's the same feeling anyone would have if they realized that in a will, they were owed an inheritance that they never received. That should bother anybody, I think.
Yeah. Another thing I just thought of now is in a lot of evangelical denominations, like these offshoot denominations, they will quote theologians from their tradition, but there's huge gaps. Like in even very high church Presbyterian offshoots, like some people in the OPC or some conservative Dutch Reformed congregations, they'll quote medieval theologians, they'll quote the Reformers, they'll quote the Protestant Orthodox scholastics, and then they'll quote some 20th century people like R.C. Sproul. But there's this massive gap where just nobody gets quoted. It's like it didn't happen. Like how many, like name a Presbyterian from the 1500s? Easy, John Knox. 1600s, most people might be able to say like Samuel Rutherford. 20th century, R.C. Sproul. Okay, 1700s, go.
I couldn't tell you.
Now I can because I'm in the PCUSA. Gilbert Tennant, John Witherspoon, James Haddo, John Thompson.
Yeah.
So when you talk to theologians in mainline churches, they tend to have a much more continuous view of history, where the theologians they quote are not necessarily the celebrity theologians, but local theologians. And I think that's important because in Reformed circles today, there's theological retrieval. They're quoting like Francis Turretin. He's good. And, Wilhelmius van Diper, the Dutch Reformed theologian I made up. Great. But they don't really have knowledge of local theologians in their own tradition that are probably just as good in terms of their doctrines, but they're just not the celebrity theologians. So even in high church circles, in high church theological retrieval circles, there's a celebrity pastor culture, but instead of mega church pastors, it's, big name theologians. So chances are your Presbyterian minister in the 1800s could not quote Turretin and von Maastricht and Gisbertus Butchus, but they probably could quote lots of local theologians who were probably just as good. I noticed that most Presbyterian theology nerds read way more Dutch Reformed theologians than Presbyterian theologians because those Continental Reformed theologians just happen to be the celebrity theologians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing that we've talked about that I think is interesting is with the kind of fundamentalist instinct about proposition control, it's also hard to put a boundary on what propositions are actually super important. And if you have a more, in my opinion, the more you read in any given tradition, let's say, I feel this way with Anglicanism, the more you're like, oh wait, actually really smart guys on both sides who used to work well together, let's say, and like the Anglican tradition, I can think of like Davenant and Usher, who were limited or who rejected limited atonement, or kind of, it's complicated. They didn't really reject limited atonement in a lot of ways, but they fought other Anglican theologians who supported limited atonement, right?
Yeah.
But there was no that issue, I imagine, could divide some more fundamentalist Presbyterians or fundamentalist Reformed folks in it over things like that, and they have,
Yeah.
and fundamentalists tend to split. In the Anglican tradition, actually, it was on divorce. So I think the continuing Anglican churches, the reason that they're all separate was, well, first there was like the Anglo-Catholics and the Reformed Anglicans who split into like the UECNA, which is small, and then the Anglo-Catholic one. Then the Anglo-Catholics all split with each other because of when it's okay to grant divorces or not. Because the Anglican tradition historically has been very strict on divorce, which you might not believe, blah blah blah. But
No,
actually,
I believe
yeah,
that I'm not going to judge you all with King Henry VIII.
yeah,
That I'm going to be soft on, but I will
yeah,
maintain conservatism leads to endless schism.
yeah,
Fundamentalism leads to endless schism. If you ever voluntarily split off, like Luther didn't voluntarily split off. If you ever voluntarily split off on the grounds of doctrinal unfaithfulness, you'll split into a million pieces. It always
yeah.
happens. Also, I just want to someone paid you, so I want to answer that question
Oh yeah,
because people who pay are
good.
better than people who don't pay. Uh, someone
True.
wants to know. Yeah, someone wants to
Thanks,
know
Travis
if
Wilson, for the $5
yeah,
super chat.
Travis
By the way,
Wilson. He wants to know if Reformed Systematic Theology series by Joel Beakey and Paul Smalley is worth buying. I mean, I haven't read it. I've listened to a little bit of Joel Beakey. I think most of these retreatist celebrity pastors are very overrated. Like they'll be quoted a lot in like popular level circles, but not really in academics. Like I've never heard squat about Joel Beakey in any academic setting, at least in like high level seminaries. He's popular among some conservative pastors, but I don't think it's really worth it. I think the sacrament test is a good test of whether a Reformed theologian is worth it. Do they articulate the Scots Confession's view of baptism, that baptism saves, communion we feed on the real body and blood of Christ? If they can articulate that, if they can attribute saving power to baptism, they're worth it. I have not seen that from Joel Beakey yet. If you want a Reformed systematic theology, I'd recommend Donald Blesh. You haven't heard of him. No one's heard of him. He's amazing. That's the thing. A lot of the times the people you hear of are not really the best. The people you don't hear of are amazing. Donald Blesh covers like every Reformed doctrine and covers every like philosophical and theological perspective on that doctrine and synthesizes a lot of apparently contradictory ideas. He basically synthesizes evangelical teachings on salvation with Karl Barth's neo-orthodoxy. Donald, and he even refutes more modern theologies. He refutes feminist theology and other, like, modern theologies that are in the seminaries right now. So I would say it's not worth it. The best alternative is Donald Blesh's systematic theology. He was at Dubuque University in Iowa. He was in the United Church of Christ, which is a based Congregationalist denomination. I don't care if they went liberal, because everything good goes liberal. So yeah, he was based. Get Donald Blesh's stuff.
yeah. Interesting. I know systematic theologies are also fun to talk about because
they're kind of modern, aren't they?
They're very modern. I was about to say that exactly.
Yeah,
I don't know any like Reformation era.
No.
There's like the tradition of like loci communes. Like I know that Vermigli has his loci communes, and then some of the Lutheran guys have their loci communes and or commonplaces. I think is how that translates. But they actually don't touch every topic, and now like every theologian has like these extremely comprehensive ones. I guess Calvin's Institutes is kind of a systematic theology.
But the thing is, they're all like the Reformation texts are all occasional documents. Like Calvin wasn't just sitting down saying, "Hey, let me write a book about every possible doctrine so that everyone will know what Mr. Calvin believed." I think the concept of a systematic is very individualistic.
Yeah.
Calvin wrote his Institutes to convince the kings that the Calvinists were not Baptist.
Yeah.
Like that's why whenever a Reformed Baptist says they're Reformed, like I'm Reformed too. I have a picture of Calvin in my profile pic. I'm like, you realize the entire Institutes were written by Calvin to convince people that Calvinists are not Baptist. I'm not even joking. That's why they were written. So all these were occasional documents. You didn't have people just pulling things out of thin air to systematize them. Even like Francis Turretin's Institutes of Alenctic Theology, it's all just to refute the Roman Catholics and Socinians and Arminians that are also espousing views on every single doctrine that he covers.
Yeah. There are a lot more, polemical documents. Even Vermigli's Loci Communis, he's debating constantly a Roman Catholic guy If you
Yeah.
read like his section on original sin, which is also funny because I'm forgetting his name, but the Roman Catholic he's arguing with denies things like original sin, which of course now Roman Catholics would be really upset to hear about. But that was common at the time of the Reformation to have all these random theologians who.
Are you telling me the Roman Catholic Church didn't always teach everything they now say you need to believe or you'll go to hell?
I know. Apparently, Pigius is his name. Pigh, I think. Figius or
Man,
Pigius or whatever. But he
next
denies original sin. So Vermiglio's
you're gonna
defending
tell
original
me
sin.
next you're gonna tell me the early church didn't venerate icons or something, man.
but that's actually a great place to go, I think, because what I think is also going to be interesting.
Oh wait, I just have to say something. I'm sorry. There's an emergency I have to attend to. Someone said, "How about systematic theology by Wayne Grudem?" Um, only if you're low on toilet paper. That's the only reason you should buy that. So Wayne Grudem he's a Baptist, so not Reformed, but there are some good Baptists. He's not one of them. He has a heretical Christology. He believes in subordinationism, and I'd say most systematic theologies are not worth it. Someone mentioned Hodge has systematic theology. That's sort of when they start to pop up. Hodge and Warfield. I don't like those guys. Princeton was never good, even before it went liberal. Princeton was always founded by New Light revivalists. And there's Zwinglian. So,
Yeah.
I mean, Hodge is obviously way better than Wayne Grudem. Hodge is not heretical like Wayne Grudem is, but no, do not read Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem. I had to say that there was an emergency in the chat. I had to make sure
So,
that I have to make sure
perfect,
that
no worries. Talking about Baptists, I think, is
are,
relevant because
yeah.
I agree. Something I've noticed that I thought was interesting. Not a lot of people who identify as Lutheran Baptists, or there are probably some who identify as Arminian Baptists, maybe. But in reality, the Reformed theology is a comprehensive system about salvation. I think, if you actually read any of the reformer era Reformed guys, a big part for them is, of course, covenant theology, which emphasizes continuity. I've been working on like a little theory in my head about which tradition emphasizes continuity with the Old Testament the most, and I think it's probably Reformed theology.
Yes,
Emphasizes
100%.
continuity the most.
I was thinking about that today.
Yes,
And
because
yeah,
what we say is, okay, Paul says baptism is circumcision in the new covenant. Okay, that was administered to babies. Okay, continuity. Unless we're given some reason to think something changed. Also, the Old Testament, God established visible organs of the church were not infallible. The priests and the rabbis and the Pharisees, they're not infallible. And so they aren't now. It can still be ordained by God, like the Old Testament hierarchy was. And they still demand a kind of normative obedience, but they can err and they have mistakes. And we have to obey them, and even if they sit on Moses' seat, whatever, yada, yada, yada.
yeah.
Versus ecclesialists will say, actually, the best part about the new covenant is that we can't make any mistakes. So don't worry. Even if you think we're wrong, we're actually right. So, but I think Reformed theology emphasizes that the most, versus a Baptist has to kind of reassume that, actually, all these things about the covenant has changed. In the Old Testament, Joshua could say, as for me and my household, and make that declaration about who they served. But in the New Testament, everyone has to make that decision for themselves, without there actually being this explicit commandment from Scripture. Anyway,
I still think you're being a propositional evangelical there in explaining why Reformed Baptists are not Reformed. So, true. That is a very real difference between Reformed Baptists and Reformed theology. Mm-hmm. However, there are people in the Reformed tradition, especially in the PCUSA, who very much dispute covenant theology. In the 1960s with Karl Barth, the PCUSA, I'm talking about the Orthodox section of it, basically abandoned covenant theology. They rejected covenant theology as a 17th century innovation that was unfaithful to Calvin himself. Now, I'm not sure where I stand in that debate. There's good arguments on both sides. The PCUSA holds to a strong Calvin versus the Calvinists theory, where they want to be faithful to Calvin, but they think his doctrines were perverted by Theodore Beza and later the federal theologians of the 17th century. So they distinguish between evangelical Calvinism, which is the good kind, and federal Calvinism, which is the Westminsterian bad kind. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'd still say even though they disagree with core aspects of Reformed Orthodoxy, they can be called Reformed due to being the heirs of the Reformed tradition. So yes, Baptists disagree with our doctrines, but even if they agreed with our doctrines, they're not heirs of our tradition. Now,
Yeah.
if those Baptists were to join Presbyterian churches and become Presbyterian ministers and then dissent from infant baptism, maybe you could call them Reformed, because we need to think of churches more as countries than as ideas. Or
I
as
would say
countries.
they have a better claim because they do have the participatory element in the tradition and in the
Yeah.
institutions and all these things that are objectively reformed.
Yeah.
But it would be less reformed to start denying those things than it
Yeah.
would be to accept those things.
Like
I would
if the
say
Greek
it's
if the
kind of
Greek
like
Orthodox if the Greek Orthodox Church suddenly changed every single one of its doctrines today, it'd still be the Greek Orthodox Church. No one would dispute
yeah,
that. If
yeah,
a guy in his basement assented to all the propositions of Greek Orthodoxy, which happens with all the Orthobros really, without going to church, they might think they're Orthodox, but the Orthodox Church would say, no, you're not one of us yet. You have to actually go to divine liturgy.
yeah.
So I think even if a Baptist, hypothetically, if a Reformed Baptist agreed with every single doctrine of the Westminster Confession, they still wouldn't be Reformed. And if a Reformed, I mean, maybe propositionally, but not participatory, and if a Reformed Presbyterian pastor completely apostatized from all the Reformed doctrines, all the Christian doctrines even, you could still call them Reformed in a sense just because of their objective participation in the institution, right?
Yeah. The example I was going to give about, I think an example of like where you're getting less like it. So in the Anglican tradition, a bunch of like when the Anglo-Catholic movement was happening, and there were some Anglo-Catholics who tried to stay with the 39 articles and some who didn't. The ones who rejected certain articles, the cassock that Anglican priests had 39 buttons for each of the articles, and some of the priests would take off the button corresponding to the article they didn't agree with. Okay. But in theory, I think you can make an argument that it's weirdly an Anglican tradition predicated on rejecting some principle of Anglicanism to remove
Yeah,
those buttons, if that makes sense. Right?
that's
It's
funny. Yeah,
actually a symbol of disagreeing with the proposition of Anglicanism that in a way shows your adherence or your allegiance to the institution, the Anglican institutions. First off, I guess we should address the super chat. Thanks, Thomas Cranberry, for the $5 super chat. Short response to being in Episcopal Church is sinful because you're in submission to apostate bishops/bishops who commune with them. I think this is for Redeemed Zoomer, maybe.
yeah, sure. So this happens a lot in Scripture where church leaders are corrupt, and there are many passages in Scripture that address false teachers, but the answer to what to do about them is always make sure you can remove them from the church. Always expel them from the church. It's never expel yourself from the church. There's not a single command in Scripture to expel yourself from an ecclesiastical body, ever. Even in cases that assume there are false teachers, it gives you a lot of list of things to do. It says to expose false doctrines. It says to kick them out of the church. It doesn't say to remove yourself from the church. In the Old Testament, like we say, continuity. In the Old Testament, there were many times when the priests were worshiping demons in the temple. They didn't say separate yourselves from these priests. They didn't say you're sinning by being in the structure where you sort of submit to these priests. They said get your priests to stop worshiping demons, bro. That's what the prophet said. And Martin Luther, who is the chief reformer, the father of the Reformation, he was in subjection to a very, unorthodox pope. He didn't want to leave. The reformers did not want to leave the church.
Yeah.
It ended up being necessary because they were threatened with death. So if Bishop Karen threatens to send an execution mob after you, then you can retreat to the ACNA or the Global Methodist Church.
Yeah.
If not, you're not in sin by being in the same church where the leadership is corrupt.
Yeah, I would say, and I wonder what your take on this is. The Anglican Communion is weird right now because in technical, like the communion has made statements critiquing and criticizing and telling people to find faithful pastors. They don't say like leave the Episcopal Church, but they did also set up the Anglican Church in North America at things like, the Jerusalem Council and all these other things that they've had in the past 20 years in the Anglican Communion. So the problem is, I mean, I would make the argument that it's at least mixed in the Anglican world right now. I wouldn't actually say that anyone in the Episcopal Church is therefore anathema. I don't think most ACNA priests would say that, or people would say that.
And I get the argument that the ACNA is still sort of mainline because they're connected to churches that are in the Anglican Communion. But because low church and because I'm an elitist, I think institutional succession matters just as much, if not more, than actual ecclesiastical succession. Because I think the having the historic institutions and being in communion with like the global academic soup of institutions is also very important, and that's something that all Christians should try to do.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, another thing that I think is interesting, and then I'll answer this next super chat. But in the Old Testament, because it was a like explicitly ethnic covenant, nobody would have said, "Oh, I'm going to start Judaism too," because of the problems in Judaism, right, or whatever what was going on in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. They wouldn't have separated because it wouldn't have felt like an option. In the early church, as far as I understand, basically the Donatists would have been like the only equivalent in the early church because they kind of start they're like we're the special elite, like the correct Christians who take all of this very, very seriously.
Yeah.
And the rest of you guys are losers for compromising and all this stuff with giving up Bibles or whatever. But really that doesn't happen a lot in the early church, of this kind of like we're the correct guys, you guys are the liberalizers, and
Yeah.
we have to start a second parallel kind of communion.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
retreatists of today are Donatists, I think. I think they are Donatists. Well, not every retreatist, but those who say you need to leave if your
Mhm.
bishop, or in my case, presbyter, is heretical. There
Mhm.
was a time when most bishops were Arian.
Yeah.
When they said Athanasius was against the world, it wasn't just the majority of the population was Arian. It means the majority of the bishops were Arian.
Yeah.
Not a single Athanasian or Athanasius himself said you need to sever communion with these heretical bishops. They said you need to get the heretical bishops out of the church. So
Mhm.
that's why, people talk about the Benedict option and the Boniface option, the Alfred option. They're all just retreatism, just with different tones of voices to them. The correct option is the Athanasius option. If your bishop is heretical, then get a new bishop. Then kick out your bishop, overthrow your bishop, and then get a good one.
So here's what the hypothesis that I proposed to Isaiah in our original stream, which I wonder what your take is on it. I think part of it has to do with personality distributions. I think I'm convinced, just doing back when I was really into politics, I think you can actually correlate for the most part people's political opinions based off of the 5 personality traits. Like, you've ever heard of the 5 personality traits? They show up in like all different kinds of studies. There's conscientiousness, which is like people who are task oriented, job oriented. Most people who are very successful economically have high conscientiousness. Then there's openness, trait openness, which means your willingness to like see new ideas and all this other kind of stuff. There's agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion. And basically all people have most people have like dominant have one dominant personality trait. I think Jordan Peterson really likes the 5 personality traits as well. But conscientiousness is what is having high conscientiousness and low in openness. Trait openness is what correlates with being conservative. And being high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness is what correlates with being liberal. Basically, conservative people are just by personality type less comfortable with disagreement than liberal people are. So, like, when a liberal person is in a church where most people are conservative, they'll vocalize their disagreement. They think that they're righteous or whatever, but they don't actually like leave. Like, they don't think that they have to start the separate institution. They almost assume they'll be the minority. It's always funny too, because then once they become the majority, they don't have any language for talking like they're the majority, so they still assume that they're like the oppressed class,
Yeah, it's
even
so
though
funny.
they're the ones that control like the denomination or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's just the way that they come at issues. Is they think of themselves as like the avant-garde kind of standard bearer,
Yeah.
and they're okay with being that way. They want to be, and if anything, pushing the boundary in a place where the boundary is farther to the right than they are, if that makes sense. Versus
Correct.
conservatives by temperament tend to be low in openness anyway, and so they don't want to have the argument, they don't want to have the conversation, they don't want to debate anybody. They just want to raise their community. And I think part of this plays out in like the evangelism styles. This is even in secular culture, in my opinion. Conservatives tend to just create more conservatives by having more kids, if that makes sense. And liberals steal their kids, if that makes sense. Like they find people raised in conservative families and then they indoctrinate them into what they believe. But they don't even have their own kids genetically, if that makes sense.
Correct.
And that's kind of how both systems maintain a 50-50 percentage of the population, yada, 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 until the cows come home.
Correct. Yeah. I've realized this a while ago and come to the hard pill to swallow, but it's a true conclusion that conservatism can't win. It's doomed. If you just look at all of the whole story of modern civilization, conservatives literally never win, ever. So I think the only answer is for Christians to rebrand progressivism. Like, progressivism is always going towards something. Right now, like, progressivism today is very different than progressivism 100 years ago. 100 years ago, progressivism was progressing towards a Marxist-Leninist utopia. That failed because obviously that just doesn't work. So now they've changed their mind about what they want to progress towards. Now it's this globalist, queer, libertarian utopia where competence is never enforced. And obviously that's going to fail pretty soon. So I think Christians need to become the new progressives. We need to become the new left. We have to abandon conservatism and become the new left. We have to ironically retreat from conservatism, become the new left. Because in the Roman Empire, the Christians were the progressives. The Christians had every trait of the progressives except what they actually believed. The Christians were the urbanists. The word pagan means rural because it used to be the cities were Christian and the countryside was rural. That's how Christians took over everything. The Christians were most involved in social justice. Christianity was denounced as the religion of women and slaves.
Yeah.
And that's how Christianity rose to the top. It conquered the institutions of the Roman Empire. So progressive and conservative are always relative terms. During the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the conservatives were the communists and the progressives were the capitalists. Progressive and conservative is just like relative terms of what's in your rear view mirror versus what's ahead on the road. Progressivism is the gas pedal of society. Conservatism is the brake pedal. The brake pedal never wins. And this is the hard pill that I want everyone to get in their heads. Conservatives never win, ever. So we have to all go through the storm. We can't go back to the old society. We need to just go through the storm of progressivism. But it's sort of like the Phoenix, the legend of the Phoenix. The first churches and institutions to go liberal will also be the first churches and institutions to go Christian again after the storm is over. It's kind of like the Phoenix. So I think that the Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ will actually be the first institutions to return to Christianity. I think the Northeast United States will be one of the first regions of the United States to return to Christianity, if any of them ever do. It's either that or everything's doomed and it's a complete black pill. But if there is any hope, if there ever will be a re-Christianization of society, it'll come from the most progressive parts of it. That's something I'm certain of.
I definitely have a lot of thoughts about that, but now I'm piling up super chats, so I want to get through them. Thanks for the $2 super chat. Anglo-Catholic Church Fathers would not like hymn worship. I think that's actually true, as far as I understand. They were mostly singing the Psalms and stuff.
Let's go.
And even the Anglican tradition, by the way, there's a strong tradition of singing the Psalms. There's literally Anglican chant, it's called. And so nothing wrong with that. I don't disagree. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Church Fathers and hymns.
I do. I am well aware that the RPCNA is most consistent with the worship of the early Church Fathers.
I think also Eastern Orthodox only do Psalms, or maybe I'm wrong.
It used to be that the Western churches only did Psalms. The Eastern churches have lots of hymnody. It's not true.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong.
Many, many hymns to the Theotokos asking her for salvation.
Oh, true. All right. Thanks for the $5. What is that? Rubles? Russian dollars? I don't know what that is. Thanks to Glossonata. Do you have any comments or thoughts about the Old Catholic Church, Utrecht, which is in full communion with the Anglican Church? I believe Old Catholic Church, Utrecht, is the liberal Old Catholics, whereas the Scranton is the other Old Catholic ones, which are the conservative ones. I'm not against them.
Ecclesialist retreatists, what a spinoff. I mean,
I
that
know.
also exists with sedevacantist, but still.
Yes. Yeah. Um, yeah. I think that's probably good. As far as I understand, same thing is true about the joint Anglican synods when we were talking about before, which are in communion with each other, and they're also in communion with the old Catholic Church Scranton or the Polish National Catholic Church. And that's cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for the super chat. $10 super chat from Beautifully Berserk, Matthew 10:23. But when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. Redeemed you, somebody else retreat us. That's
I
true. There's a whole
admit
stomp your feet at them and stuff like that. But
persecution is legitimate grounds for retreat. That's apostasy is not grounds for retreat. The early Christians in the Jewish temple, they were worshiping in a temple run by people who killed God. You can't get more heretical than killing God, okay? You can't get more heretical and apostate than deicide.
mm-hmm.
They didn't leave on the grounds of apostasy. They left when they were persecuted. Martin Luther did not leave the Church of Rome on the grounds of their apostasy, on the grounds of their false teaching. He left when he was persecuted. The Scottish Covenanters, they were persecuted for holding to their beliefs, so they were sort of forced to separate, but they had an actually very realistic chance of making the Church of Scotland worse in this channel's opinion, and they succeeded in doing that, so I'm happy. So I've always said that persecution is grounds for retreat. You know, if it weren't for young Anglicans folks persecuting my folks, we would never have the awesome USA in America. So I'm grateful for that.
I know it's actually I was going to talk about this earlier. So some of the propositions we now think of as unimportant is in church history they thought of as very important, and then the reverse is true. There's some things we think are really important now that they didn't think were as important then.
Yeah.
I think we had a little bit of a Twitter joke back and forth about like Reformed Anglicans and Reformed British people in like the 1600s murdering each other over polity. And that really was what it is. Like if you just read like James Usher as another good example of this, John Davenant, they're just Reformed, but they really believe in bishops. And then if you read the Presbyterians, they're just Reformed, but they really don't believe in bishops. And so they're like, and they literally kill each other over this.
Yeah.
And today we would be like, I mean, whatever, who cares?
Now these days, people are like, "Oh, I'm Baptist, I'm Catholic." Well, we basically believe the same stuff. Even Pope Francis is like praying with some Muslims and stuff. And the ecumenical patriarch is praying with Pope Francis. All these things. Back then, basically everyone in England agreed on being reformed in terms of doctrine. They disagreed on polity, and the Scottish Covenanters were willing to sacrifice their lives for the gospel. They defined the gospel as not having bishops because they said Christ is the only head of the church. And even my PCUSA church, which is honestly very mid, got an exchange pastor from the Church of Scotland for a month. He was super based, super evangelical, and his church was a former Covenanter church. So he even said, our church is named after the Covenanters who died for the gospel, and he defined the gospel in modern day as not having bishops. So even if the entire world became your denomination, people would still find reasons to kill each other.
Yeah. And I think also part of that has to do, this is what I was going to say, a lot of them thought of the religious issues they were dealing with as public square issues. Like this is a important thing that has to be acknowledged in the public square as well. So like the Puritans were mad that even if they got to go off into their own corner to do their own Puritan things, they wanted the Church of England to be purified because that was the public, institution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they cared about that.
Yeah.
Public institutions.
Yes.
Modern evangelicals don't care. They're saying, oh, the King of England's not Puritan. I'm going to make my own king in my basement. I'm the king of my own kingdom.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, the Reformation, those were all based off of national churches. So they basically saw these national churches as the subjects of reform. They weren't going to set up a parallel one nearby. You might think I'm hypocritical, but I actually do agree with a lot of the logic of the Reconquista in that the way that this is how Christians always thought. I think one of the differences and the difficulties practically is that the public square no longer sees itself as being related in any way to Christianity, versus at the time of the Puritans and the Church of England and all these controversies we're talking about in the 1600s and the 1500s, the public square did see itself as being related to Christianity. And so when Christians showed up and said, here's what we think the public square should do, it was actually a battle between basically those three groups, the Puritans, Presbyterians, and the Anglicans in, say, England, right, in the Civil War. Yeah. Today, when we're talking about the public square, which I would say the mainline still participates in, they still try to participate in the public square. There are so many other groups that are explicitly not Christian that are also participating in the public square. And so you're not just battling people, say, in your denomination, you're also battling the way that that denomination will relate to the public square. A great example of this is if you actually look at like the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ. I don't know too much about the PCUSA, but they actually have more official statements about politics than evangelical churches do. They'll have like entire lists about this Supreme Court decision, we're condemning it, or that, or this, or whatever.
Because they're involved, as they should be, just not in the right way. But I don't think that really justifies retreatism, because J. Gresham Machen, the patron saint of all retreatists, J. Gresham Machen retreated back when Christianity was very much governing the public square, and the public square still identified nominally as Christian. Like the liberal churches back then were almost the opposite of liberal churches today. They loved Christian culture and morals. They just didn't like Christian theology. And like modern day progressive Episcopalians, they kind of like Christian theology. They just don't like Christian morals and culture.
True, actually. And no, I think you also tweeted this earlier, but liberal theology when all this started being a thing is kind of the reverse of liberalism in mainline churches today, where it used to be they didn't like the resurrection, they didn't like the idea of God and an interventionist God and all these kinds of things that would do miracles, and they didn't like that, but they still were very focused on things like marriage and charity and all these other things, and social influence and cleaning up the streets or whatever. But today, in a lot of theological liberals, they do really like the idea of the miraculous and talking about the spirit and super spiritual stuff. They just don't like the moral worldview of Christianity. They disagree with it. And I think that's a symptom of exactly what I was kind of saying before about the public square, because it just almost, even for Roman Catholics, by the way, it's impossible for them to genuinely participate in public institutions like the presidency of the United States, like Joe Biden, and actually hold faithfully to the doctrines of their church that they claim to believe in. Even J.D. Vance, who is a Roman Catholic, had to pull back his stance on abortion to be the vice president of the Republican Party, which is really sad. But it just shows how far the public space has drifted. So I wouldn't say this is me saying that the Reconquista's logic is illegitimate, but just this is a more difficulty that's hoisting itself in the way of Reconquista because of how far the public square has drifted away. And I think it's almost, to give a point in favor of the Reconquista, it's almost like saying, a lot of people point this out and then say the Reconquista doesn't make any sense because you'll never win. So it's like, it sounds cliche, but it's like, well, you miss all of the shots you don't take. You know what I mean? Like in basketball, right? So if a guy has a 100% shoot rate, like every time he shoots the basketball, he makes it in, but he only shoots one per game. He's a way worse player than the guy who shoots 40 from the three and makes it once, right? Because he makes one more point than the guy who only gets the 2-pointer, and that's the only one he ever shot. So I don't know, maybe you have thoughts on the whole idea of the public square and the difficulty and how to overcome that difficulty or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard to really have the same type of mainline Protestantism we used to have without Christianity being in the public square. But I also don't think we can get the public square back until we have united church organizations. Because I just don't think conservatives ever will be able to just assemble themselves into strong institutions. Conservatives cannot reconcile differences. It's why every tradition has one mainline denomination and a bunch of little smaller conservative ones. I think conservatism is irredeemably doomed and will never make a cultural impact. And there are sometimes right-wing reactionary movements, but reactionary movements run out of steam real fast. Same with right-wing populist movements. I think the only thing we can do is let society get worse, and eventually leftism as we know it will die out. Something else will replace it. What will that thing be? Well, that depends on who stayed in the mainstream institutions during the storm. So I think if we want that thing to be Christianity, we need Christians to stay in the mainstream institutions, like liberal colleges and liberal churches. And if we don't do that, if Christians keep being on the side, keep being on the margins of society, then whatever comes after leftism will be something else. It might be Andrew Tate right-wing paganism, where you have a few men who get like a bunch of women and the rest of men get nothing. It might be Jordan Petersonism, right? It might be some nerdy technocratic society where robots are in charge. But if Christians don't get back into the mainstream institutions, then whatever comes after leftism, and something will come after leftism, it's not going to last forever, but it won't be Christianity unless Christians get their butts back in the mainstream institutions.
Or it's going to be the Amish. That's another thing that's always interesting. We've talked about this before, but if you just look at like demographic trends, I forget what the statistics are, but like Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania in like 2070 or whatever, if they continue repopulating at the current rate, will be like half Amish people. But of course, there's probably going to be a plateau or something like that. Who knows, right? But I think there's also this assumption by lots of conservatives that they'll kind of retreat and outpopulate the mainstream society. I think the problem with this is, and this has been a problem with conservatives since the beginning, is drip. So like people like the OPC, I think if you asked, okay, well, we're retreating now, but in what is it, 200 years, 150 years, we'll be big because we'll be building up our institution. But actually, they're not even as big as the PCA today.
They're not even as big as ECO and EPC. Yeah. They're not.
So,
exactly. Yeah. You're right. The conservatives always think that we can retreat now, our grandchildren will fight. But that's what every generation says.
Yeah.
The conservatives of 100 years ago said that, and then 70 years ago, and then 40 years ago. It's like, when does it end? And the thing is, conservatives can't stay together for more than 10 years. Like a lot of times, some of these Christian nationalist folks will be like, oh, Rome wasn't built in a day. Give us a few hundred years to build our institutions. Then we're going to have cathedrals and control the world. You guys split every 10 years. Okay. You're not going to stay
together. I totally agree with you. I'll see lots of people talking about it's so much harder to build an institution that lasts than it is even actually to build the first generation of the institution. Like, and I think this just comes from when you study history, especially church history and recent church history. Look at all these little denominations that thought they were going to be the supplanting, denomination in however long, and they just aren't. I mean, it's sad, but it's also something I've thought about too. Okay, what the LCMS ELCA split is really interesting to me because the ELCA is clearly, when the people talk about the seven sisters of the main line, the ELCA is the one they're talking about, not the LCMS. Even though the LCMS has been around just as long as the ELCA, but just as separate Lutheran denominations in their own prospective domains. But one of the key differences, I think, is that the ELCA was the mainline Lutheran that was trying to be more in the American public square. Even today, if you look up that whole zip code thing I was talking about before, like which churches have a church in every zip code, the ELCA actually has better zip code coverage than the LCMS because they were trying to be the mainline Lutheran church. That was an attempt. They were trying to be a national church more so than if you look at LCMS history. They're very concentrated in the Midwest where there were lots of German immigrants. And then they've since then expanded. So like if you go to any downtown, old historic New England town, Pennsylvania town, New Jersey, whatever, places where I spent a long time, the downtown Lutheran church is the ELCA one. And it's this beautiful Gothic church. And in theory, if all it took was being around for a long time to get the beautiful historic buildings, the LCMS should have just as many as the ELCA, but they don't, in my personal experience. The ELCA does, because the ELCA was willing to be the public square version of Lutheranism in a way that the LCMS just really never has been.
I'm going to push back. I think you're right that the ELCA did engage with the culture more, and the ELCA is much more recognized in the LCMS. So I think you're right about that. I think in some sense the LCA is more mainline, but regarding buildings specifically, it's not really correct that the LCMS has any shortage of beautiful buildings. The LCMS is the only conservative denomination that I think has a sufficient supply of beautiful buildings. They have tons of them. Even in places where they're not that populated, they're still there. Maybe not as many.
I'm just going off of anecdotal. Like, I know my town has 2 ELCA churches. Both of them are downtown and
but
big.
Who's the first and only person in history to make a worldwide map of confessional Protestant churches?
That's true. That's true. You probably have a better.
I can post this in the chat.
That's a good idea.
There are, like, I made a historic churches map. I try to have a confessional Protestant church, or at least a conservative Protestant church with a beautiful building in every major city and town in the United States. And a lot of times when I can't find like a Presbyterian or Anglican or Reformed church to put there, I'll just look at the LCMS church map to see if I can find one. Usually I can, and it's usually a beautiful building. So even though LCMS didn't engage with culture as much as the LCA, even though it's not quite as widespread, doesn't have quite that zip code coverage, it is still quite, good.
Mm-hmm. True. And I don't want to downplay them. They're obviously better than the ACNA. So I can't really throwing stones in glass houses or whatever. But I guess the thing I was going to ultimately say was the mainline churches that are old, that are still conservative. We've talked about, like, the SBC is also one of those. They're actually very regional, if that makes sense. I mean, it's literally called the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah.
And the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They're literally named after the places where they had the most coverage or whatever, or they're the center of their institution. And I think part of that is the same as you can see this happening again with Orthodox Americans. So I said this, I think, on my last stream, actually, but if you talk to people in, like, the Greek Orthodox Church, American Greek Orthodox people are much more religiously conservative than Greeks in Greece. People in Greece are very irreligious, just because they've become very secularized. But when they came to the United States, being Greek Orthodox was like a part of the culture of being Greek, so they had to give a kind of deference to the church, which had this control over the cultural, the culture of Greek Americans. And so because the church had a kind of monopoly over that smaller public square, it made the public square more conservative, and it gave the church more authority. And then the church didn't lag as much. So I would say the same thing happened with the LCMS and the SBC. Like, the Midwest and the South are more conservative than the country as a whole. And so the churches that are geared towards the country as a whole are less conservative than those regional.
Again, I'm gonna push back. I think you tend to analyze a lot of things through like a historical, cultural lens.
Sure.
I tend to think it less so. A lot of times, the entire course of a denomination is based on the decisions of a few people. My counterexample is the Christian Reformed Church, the CRCNA, which is very prominent in the North, in like the Great Lakes regions.
True.
And the CRCNA, it's like it was basically a touch and go situation. It was like if a few micro variables had been different, it would have seen the exact same liberal drift everything else did. But because the conservatives stood their ground and didn't retreat, the CRCNA is actually swinging back to the right after flirting with gay marriage. And I think it's the best example of a successful Reconquista. True. So I guess that denominations that are more centered on like an ethnic heritage might be more likely to stay
because it's a smaller public square. Remember I was talking before, right? So in like America as a public square, there are all of these other institutions that are trying to like have their say about what goes on in the public square that is America. But in like Dutch American subculture, there are not that many institutions other than the CRCNA that have a major investment in that public square. right?
Yeah.
The same thing would be true about German Americans. Like the LCMS historically has had a lot of say on the cultural history of German Americans, and things like, the I don't know, National Review or whatever, or like CNN, they don't care that much about German American
Yeah.
specifics, but they do care about like American national politics. So I think that's part of it. The SBC, again, being Southern, is similar because Southern culture tended to be more conservative. Also, that's just kind of rural. Like the CRCNA is also Dutch Americans were more rural, like Michiganers, Ohio, Iowa, whatever. LCMS is kind of like the Dakotas and rural, and the South is rural, versus the cities were definitely kind of whatever the opposite of Reconquista, the like liberalized
Yeah.
first in
I'm
America.
I'm looking at a map of where LCMS is prominent now, and yeah, it's got some things in the Dakotas, but it's very, very prominent in like the Great Lakes, even in very urban areas.
Mm.
Like I found like 30 amazing LCMS cathedrals in the city of Milwaukee alone.
Yeah,
So and even in like Buffalo, New York, LCMS is very prominent. So they started out as a very regional church, but they
yeah,
really spread their wings a lot in the
yeah.
past 150 years.
Mhm.
So I think the LCMS is like the model of what a conservative denomination in the present day should be. It's not
Yeah.
perfect. I think they still have some of the negative aspects of conservatism, like young Earth creationism, which is very strict there. But even the LCMS, I would not say it's that much of a rural or regional denomination. Same with the CRC, very prominent in like Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's one of the Dutch Reformed, utopias.
Mhm.
So I guess what you're saying is true to an extent.
Mhm.
Denominations that tend to have this national identity tend to also be more liberal because they're just sort of connected to the national culture as a whole. But
Mhm.
I don't think there's as much of a correlation as maybe you're proposing there is. I don't know.
Maybe not. Maybe not. I only point this out to talk about the participatory element, because
Right.
if something that's very important to your life is the specific church and the historic teachings of that church and the tradition of that church is important to your everyday life, not just your Sunday life, that does actually have an effect on, you know, what you end up believing, if that makes sense. So people who they at the end of the day, for some convictional theological reason, maybe they do think the propositions are more important than the participatory liturgical life or whatever. Still, the participatory feeds into the propositional beliefs, because if you have a culture that is informed by the church and that you're living out, if most of your, it's weird today how much we move, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
the fact that you're not going to die in the same town you were born in, and that you've been more than 40 miles from where you were born, and that's true about me, that's true about almost everybody I know, is historically unique fact. It also means people are less likely to invest in the like long-term stability of a single physical place. Um, you know, Points for Reconquista too, just the foods for thought though. When you are somebody who is willing to do that though in a local area, I've noticed people that do that, they have an enormous outsized impact on that area, because nobody else is stepping up to have that role in these local communities anymore in the same way. Like people are just going all over the place. They're not as well connected. My wife's grandfather, who actually just passed away, he's the one that was very involved in that church. He was like that in his town. Like he was the do everything guy in that town, and he just accumulated like all of this social capital. It's like hard to explain, but like he was silent generation, I guess you could say. He's a little bit older than a boomer, and I think boomers are kind of the beginning of it. But like there's, especially actually in the main line, he was very involved in his diocese in the Episcopal Church. Like they just don't have people to do any of the functions of all of these institutions anymore. And so if you're willing to put yourself out there, you'll get picked up to do like 1.5 million things for this. And that's effectively the definition of power. People always want to talk about like power and who holds the levers of power and institutions or whatever. I think one of the unfortunate realities in a lot of these mainline churches is another reason that they end up liberalizing is the people who take charge now aren't even that pious. Like they don't actually even care that much about Christianity specifically. They just get roped into doing things as these institutions start dying. And so they're not even that particularly, they probably just happened to be at an Episcopal church when the diocese needed a new treasurer. And somebody said, oh, yeah, this guy was an accountant in his day job. So can he be the treasurer for our diocese?
Yeah.
And then he ends up having this outsized impact on the entire diocese denomination, yada, yada, yada. But he's not been well catechized at all. He doesn't think about these things. So I don't know. I'm more sympathetic to Reconquista than maybe some other guys are, because I do see that. I see it happening in some places. I see it being heavily resisted in other places. The practicality of it is bad. There's seriously leadership problems as well in the mainline churches. There's just really bad leadership.
Yeah. Well, the starting point for Reconquista is just being in the main line, seeing how liberal it is, and hearing all the conservatives saying it got this bad because people kept leaving. And then the second thing is just seeing the massive, like just how much more rich the heritage of all the mainline churches is. Talking about the participatory aspect, just seeing how much more stuff they have. It's like even if the conservative denominations got tons of money today, they still wouldn't even know what aspects of church life to get back. Like all these little details, like the plaques about what this person did for the church, or these gardens where tons of people over the years add little things that represent little things. There's just, I think that's why Catholicism and Orthodoxy feel like such fuller, richer traditions, because that's what always happens when you have a rich old tradition, but it's just alien to most of conservative Protestantism these days.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think the same problems that are happening in conservative evangelicalism are also happening in lots of ways in those denominations. Like if you look at a Roman Catholic church built in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, or whatever, they're also weird and they look like modernist and they're not very pretty and they have all these problems. It was just what was being built at that time. The difference is they still have all of the buildings built before then in their denomination that are classically beautiful and whatever.
Yeah.
But they also have the same problems as the mainline in lots of ways, like with cultural participants in those traditions that don't take the tradition as seriously. Interesting example is the student ministry at the school I used to go to for the Roman Catholics. They had like 2 priests for a huge number of people that would go, and they were always overwhelmed, but none of the students ever volunteered to help or do anything. So they were always short-staffed, whatever, and people didn't show up enough to build a relationship with the staff, versus there was an evangelical church, which like everybody in the congregation had a job of some kind in the actual running of the church. And they were way more like engaged and involved. And I always remember thinking, like, what if all of those evangelicals, and this is like more when I was less, theologically developed, what if they all just went to that Roman Catholic church, got really involved, but kept all of their theology? They would literally just they would turn all these Roman Catholics who are cultural Roman Catholics into evangelicals by accident because of how much they're willing to actually participate and work for their local church and do these things and be ushers and greet people and help with the worship service.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to conclude, I think maybe I don't like when people, especially conservatives all the time, they talk about problems and not offering real solutions. So, I mean, I'm curious, what do you think the best, like there's a lot of potential solutions. What do you think the best solution to gaining back a Protestantism, or maybe even Anglicanism, just Anglicanism? I'm not expecting you to care about us heathens that don't have apostolic succession. How should you get back in Anglicanism? That's both participatory and propositional.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been trying to do is Anglican Renaissance. And in the Anglican world, there's all these organizations that are actually pan-jurisdictional. So like if anyone knows what Forward in Faith is, which is a traditionalist Anglican organization, they don't actually operate within the ACNA or the Episcopal Church or within the continuing Anglican churches. But people who are part of those different groups can actually work together and coordinate and share resources and all these kinds of things. And so it gives some of the advantages of being in an older institution, because these institutions are older, while, still being able to say, like, yeah, if the church near you has like rainbow flags and there's no faithful Episcopal church near you or whatever, or ACNA church near you, you can go to the continuing Anglican church, but still be connected to, and just think of yourself as an Anglican, but not specifically jurisdictional, and trying in whatever context God places you to make that setting both more propositionally traditional Anglican, and participatorily Anglican. So if you're at an ACNA church, that would mean, could mean sometimes, lots of ACNA churches are liturgical, but lots aren't. Trying to fix the liturgy if the beliefs are all right, and if you're at an Episcopal church, trying to fix the beliefs and the preaching and all the other things if the liturgy is all right. And I think I see those basically as equivalent tasks. And oftentimes, fixing the liturgy or whatever is actually easier than fixing the, going to your priest or whatever, or your bishop, and saying, change the beliefs of the denominations. But also I tend not to malign people who are in the Episcopal Church for lots of reasons. I mean, we've had conversations about this. So
my answer is this, and I've gotten worse than I used to be. I've gotten more like radical Reconquista. Like I used to say, like, oh, bro, trust me, there's conservative mainline churches. Just go to those. People are saying, why not just make the offshoots more traditional? Why not just give the offshoots that participatory aspect? And what I've been telling myself is two things. One, it is so much easier to change the propositions of a denomination than to change the participatory aspect. It takes 300 years to build up an institution and just a generation to hijack it. And that is always going to be one of the biggest arguments for why Reconquista is a much quicker and better way to achieve that than trying to traditionalize the offshoots. And the second thing is, if your church is not giving you the participatory aspect, you cannot supplement that for yourself. There's no way to get that if your church is not teaching it to you. But if your church is not teaching you the propositional aspect, you can supplement that on your own. Like, I used to be in a PCUSA church that had an actual heretical female pastor. We now have a non-heretical male pastor. We had a heretical female pastor. She was actually a heretic, and her sermons were crap. But the participatory aspect of the service was great. I was still spiritually fed through that. And every Sunday I would go home and listen to a Tim Keller sermon and study theology on my own. So I would say that, honestly, it's not wrong to attend even a liberal church. As like, if you have kids that you need to raise well, then I would say stick to the conservative main lines. But if not, go to the liberal church. Why not? Because you have to realize there were centuries upon centuries. If you're Protestant, you believe there were centuries upon centuries where Christians were going to churches with blatantly false teaching and zero discipleship, and they were still saved, and they were still okay. I have a very high view for how bad your church can be, and you can still be saved. So if it is so easy to supplement the propositional aspect for yourself, it is so hard to supplement the participatory aspect of for yourself. So I'd say, unless you have very, very young, impressionable children, go to liberal church, knock yourself out.
Yeah, I think also, as far as I understand, your stance would be that, like, sacraments, well, specifically the Lord's Supper, I think we would both agree baptism can be administered by anybody. But like the Lord's Supper, if you had a female pastor, could still be, it would still be a valid Eucharist. Versus in the Anglican tradition, partially because we do require at least presbyterial succession, and we would kind of have an ontological view of the priesthood. Like, you either are, in the eyes of God, a priest, or you are not. And women wouldn't be priests.
I mean, then go to a liberal male priest. I don't know. Yeah. They're like, even in mainline churches, the at least 50% of the priests are still going to be male. So but
then even if they're a male priest, but they were ordained by a female bishop or something like that, it can, in the Anglican context, it can become squirrely in that
what
way.
what makes
Yeah.
like I know some people have that ontological metaphysical where not like I think women can be pastors, they just shouldn't.
Mhm.
And I think there's some instances of God calling women to be pastors when there are no qualified men. Same with like Deborah. So I'm a normatively complementarian, not absolutely. But it makes just instinctively, it doesn't make sense to say female priests are invalid, but gay male priests are valid, or trans women
Well,
priests are
it's
valid.
because we're not Donatists, right? So it's actually not about what the person believes or does or practices. It's just about whether or not they categorically can be a priest or not. And a gay man can be a priest. He shouldn't. I mean, that was the controversy that started the ACNA, right? Was Gene
Yeah.
Robinson being a married gay man? But like, if the Donatists would say basically that the gay man doesn't have valid sacraments, but then you can imagine a hypothetical like
No,
complementary or egalitarian Donatist who thinks that the woman priest does have valid sacraments, but not the gay man. You know, there's probably someone in the ACNA who
I
believes that.
know.
I'm not sure
I don't
where,
know.
but yeah.
What I'm saying is, I think most of the retreatist mindset is Donatism. To think the means of grace cannot reach you if the beliefs of your pastor or in your church are heretical. Like, even if I'm asking someone, is your church doing the sacraments? Are they preaching the word? Even if they're not preaching it well, during medieval Catholic Church, they were not preaching it well. Unless they are literally blaspheming the Eucharist, and unless they're literally not reading the Bible, if they're reading some gay feminist translation of the Bible and not doing communion, then you need to leave. Then you're not getting the means of grace. If the priest is liberal and preaches awful sermons, but you're still getting the means of grace, you do not have to leave.
Yeah. Here's my question. We talked about the LCMS today, and I think you're very positive about the LCMS.
Yeah.
If the LCMS is that kind of good institution, is there any reason maybe somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, wait, shouldn't I just be LCMS? Because
yeah, I don't really mind that.
Yeah.
It's not the LCMS, the LCA situation is very different from the PCA, PCUSA, or ACNA Episcopal. I think those two are parallel. But there is some still unique qualities of the ELC. It's got more of that Scandinavian Lutheran heritage as opposed to the German heritage. It's a little bit more widespread. But if the ELCA just dies completely, stops existing, the Lutheran tradition in America survives. If the Episcopal Church dies, Anglicanism in America dies. If the PCUSA dies, Presbyterianism in America dies. Because these evangelical offshoots, they'll just bifurcate into a million pieces, and they'll just basically stop being relevant within 30 years. So
here's a thought that I've had too, because part of the decay in the main lines is the split, which they can't be undone. So like if you look at the history of the Episcopal Church, like in the past 10 years, they've lost 600 parishes. They've had to close, but that's only in their registers. 417 of them are ACNA churches right now. But the 200 of them, yes, were legitimately just closed because they closed them. So a big part of like the decline, when you see the statistics for the Episcopal Church's decline, is the Anglican Church. And I can tell you, going to any ACNA church, most of the people there are either former evangelicals or former Episcopalians, because the denomination isn't old enough or whatever. So, like a part of me, like I is sympathetic to Reconquista. I said on Twitter a while ago, actually, like I'm more likely to be a Reconquista Episcopalian than I am to be Roman Catholic, because at its foundation, Protestants can be reformed. Like the Episcopal Church, at least in theory, could just change all the propositional statements they have that I would disagree with. It's possible. The problem is, it's like if the ACNA didn't exist, I would be easily very supportive of Reconquista. You know what I mean? Like I would not advocate for the split that does currently exist, but the split does currently exist. So it makes it a lot harder to like do the jurisdictional math. Like it's almost like, do you ever feel fatalistic? Like, well, it already happened. Like it's kind of too late, or you know what I mean?
I get the argument that like there's a lot of people who concede to me that the splits were the bad choice, but they also say now that they happened, you can't do anything about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But it's like the concept of Reconquista applies universally. There's always a choice to be made because this splits didn't just happen once. They keep happening again and again. And even now, a lot of churches are considering leaving main lines and going evangelical. It's still relevant to talk about this, even if you have that position, which I don't. The question of Reconquista is still relevant. And if you're considering leaving one of the offshoots, like a lot of people were considering leaving the ACNA if it wasn't being quite as harsh on women's ordination as they should be. Now, I'd be perfectly comfortable being in an explicitly egalitarian denomination like ECO if it holds to the essentials of basic Christianity. I'm fine with that, and is participatory in the Presbyterian tradition. But to answer your question, what about the LCMS? What about it? Technically, it is close enough to being mainline for it to be good enough for me. Yeah, it's never been that institutionally connected, but Lutherans in America as a whole have always been sort of like a minority immigrant group. So I'm okay with that. The ELCA Reconquista is not nearly as important as the Episcopalian Reconquista or the United Methodist Reconquista or the Presbyterian Reconquista. The big three denominations of the Reconquista are PCUSA, Episcopal, and United Methodist.
Mm-hmm. An interesting conversation we had before too is it almost would make more sense if all of the Reconquistaists, because the irony would be if say I joined the Reconquista tomorrow, I started going to an Episcopal church. I actually don't have any blood connection to the Episcopal church. I'm luckily, I mean, it would kind of make sense in my situation because of my wife, right? But like lots of people today that are finding my channel, finding your channel, who are coming back into classical magisterial Protestantism would actually be newcomers to these institutions. So they could, in theory, just end up in any of the main lines. Like they're not just staying anywhere. They would be actively joining.
Yeah.
And it would almost make more sense if we said, okay, this is the one mainline church. We're going to Reconquista all together. Because separated, they don't have as much of an influence. You know what I mean? Like on any one denomination to Reconquista. And if I'm not mistaken, even you said that the Episcopal Church would be the best one, the one most worth Reconquistaing.
Yeah, like the only reason that we're not doing that, the only reason that we're not going to try and just push all our efforts on like one mainline denomination is because it's kind of rare to find parishes that are mainline and conservative. So it's rare that you'll have a conservative PCUSA, Episcopalian, and United Methodist Church in the same town. Usually it's just one of the three, or maybe a conservative of some other mainline denomination. Most people aren't going to move for the Reconquista. So the Reconquista,
which is the thing, sorry.
We're just encouraging, we're going to say it's probably interesting.
I was going to say, I think that's the next problem today with modern conservative Christians is people used to literally say, oh, I cannot move to that town because it doesn't have my denomination church.
No, I've talked about that a lot. People used to change their change where they live based on their denomination, and now they change their denomination based on where they live. They're like the people discipling the people giving my wife and I marriage counseling, like premarital counseling in the PCA was required. PCA elder husband, they went to a Nazarene church once because there wasn't a good Presbyterian church in the area. And people ask me, where would you go if there's not a good Presbyterian church in the area? My answer is I would not go to an area without a good Presbyterian church. I don't care if my job mandates it. Religion is most important. It used to be most important to people.
Yeah. I know. I've always in the back of my head, like fantasized about moving to Fort Worth or one of these older, because that's the next thing too about Reconquista in the Episcopal Church and the ACNA. There are whole dioceses that left the Episcopal Church for the ACNA. So like Fort Worth or Quincy or Pittsburgh or whatever, where they still have all of the old stuff that their diocese had. The problem for lots of churches was when they tried to leave as individual churches, they had problems. But when the whole diocese could leave. Anyway, I've always thought, I think
if you see my screen changing colors, is because I'm looking at the churches map to look at the places you're talking about, like South Carolina and Fort Worth.
Yeah. Like Charleston, I think, has like 5 ACNA churches per square mile or something. Not that exaggerated, but
it's not a lot.
Yeah,
South
because that diocese left. Yeah.
If you're in South Carolina, it makes sense to be ACNA rather than Episcopal. I'll grant you that.
Yeah.
And if you're in Fort Worth. But
yes, yeah, if you're in Fort Worth. But my point is, I've felt like, it would be amazing just to move to that part of the country because you would be attached to so much Anglican heritage because of it. And I think, but people literally just did do that. And
mhm,
when, say, a Dutch person was moving to the United States, the reason they all moved to like Michigan is because that's where all the other Dutch people were. And that's why the CRC, like we were just talking about, is so based in that area. Same thing with German immigrants. They would find
yeah.
where other German immigrants were, like they tried to cluster in the same areas as other people that they felt like were culturally like them. But we just don't, we don't do that anymore, which is kind of sad. It's interesting because in a diocesanal model and say like the Episcopal Church, like it would be very easy if say like all of us were like, we're going to move to, Rhode Island, and the Diocese of Rhode Island will become the base diocese because we'll all the conservative Anglicans will live in Rhode Island tomorrow.
Yeah, well, that's also why. Can you see why I'm so pessimistic about modern conservatives'
Yeah.
ability to do anything ever? It's because they're just lame. It's like we think of ourselves as we pat ourselves on the back for being the conservative ones because we're less progressive than the current progressives. But most modern conservatives are they're not going to go to learn masonry to build a beautiful church. They're not going to go move for their denomination. Most modern conservatives are still super duper modernist and pathetic compared to we're just regular Christian men of 100 years ago. So that's why I
Yeah.
say the reason we can't rebuild is not because rebuilding is never an option. It's because we're too stupid and dumb and incompetent to rebuild.
I mean, just practically, like the average person 200 years ago, 300 years ago, like they could build their house. Like I always think whenever I'm watching like Little House on the Prairie, my wife loves watching like the 70s show. Like everyone in this town built their house literally. So they were capable of doing that. So then when they have to build a church and the whole town comes together to build a church, like all of them can contribute uh,
Yeah.
to making a big, beautiful church, yada, 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 whatever, in a serious way. But today, everyone just pays a bunch of construction workers way too much money to build like a very small church comparatively, and it's much a larger portion of our income and our all these other things. Yeah, I think it's sad to see the kind of decay that's happened in our ability, but that is also just because of specialization in labor and whatnot, over time. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know. All right, any other thoughts? Maybe we'll wrap it up in like 14 minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions, yeah, Teams, if you have any other thoughts, maybe.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to express thoughts that are not just more Reconquista ads because everyone's probably sick of that. Um, what I would say is maybe now I'll target the LARPers
Yeah.
because that's sort of what started a lot of this, but we spent most of the time talking about the nitty gritty details of Reconquista. So I'm going to say that if you cannot call yourself a Presbyterian if you do not attend a Presbyterian church. I don't care if there's something preventing you from attending one. You're still not one. Okay. You cannot call yourself Anglican if you
Yeah.
don't attend an Anglican church. You cannot call yourself Roman Catholic if you don't attend Catholic church. If I start believing in Catholicism today, I'm not a Catholic until I actually go to RCIA, become a catechumen, and ideally eventually join the church. So a lot of times people who are non-denominational investigate these traditions without ever actually going to one of them, without ever actually experiencing it. Now, a lot of times, Orthodox people will criticize me, saying, I talk a lot about Orthodox doctrine, but I've never actually experienced an Orthodox liturgy. It's true. I actually haven't. And, maybe when I visit my first Orthodox liturgy, I'll just be moved to convert. The reason I haven't gone to an Orthodox liturgy yet is honestly, I'm busy and I don't care.
I've been to an Eastern Orthodox liturgy and I didn't instantly convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. So
Okay, yeah, I'll say you went on my behalf. Okay.
yeah, yes, yeah. And I've been to Vespers services and stuff like that. I have a friend who's Eastern Orthodox. Actually,
Yeah.
it's the irony is I'm constantly defending Protestantism on here, but almost all my friends in real life who don't go to my specific church are either Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox.
Most of my
But
friends in real life are not Presbyterian.
yeah, yes, yeah.
But that's fine. It's like,
Mhm.
I will say, you don't need to attend something to know it's wrong. I'm
Yeah.
not going to say you have to attend a Kingdom Hall at Jehovah's Witness to say Jehovah's
Yes,
Witnesses
yeah.
are wrong.
Um,
I don't need to attend an Orthodox liturgy to know it's wrong. I still think you need to attend something to know it's right.
mhm.
To So I would say, if you're going to say Orthodoxy is right, then you should attend a divine liturgy.
Yeah.
If you're going to say Reformed theology is right, you have to attend a real Presbyterian or Reformed church.
Yeah. I would actually say, I wish we had talked about this longer too, now that I'm thinking about it. But people will talk about like justification. I talked about this yesterday on my stream too for a long time if you want to talk about it. But the Bible actually uses justification in like three kind of ways. Like people talk about like just James's doctrine of
Yeah.
justification versus Paul. When James is talking about justification, he is talking about whether or not you are in the group. Like he tells you about who to trust as being actually saved. So he's talking about judge them by their works, all this kind of
Coram
thing.
Deo
How
versus
can
Coram
somebody
Mundo.
yeah. How can somebody say to you that they have faith if they have not works? Right.
Yeah.
So it's about policing the community. That
Yeah.
only really makes sense if you believe that the community has something to do with your salvation. To use
Yeah.
that word in both of those contexts, if you are excommunicated, right? This is the thing that a lot of like, modern softeners of like anathemas in like people will talk about like Nicaea 2's anathemas are not, they don't mean you're damned for sure. They're actually becoming more like non-denominationals who think you don't have to like go to church regularly and do all these things to be saved and take communion.
Yeah.
Because if you actually get excommunicated for years and you're not actually hooked up with a church, your salvation is genuinely in question.
Yeah.
Like your ability to persevere in the faith is going to be obviously hampered by not actually even going to church, let alone calling yourself Anglican or Presbyterian and not going to those specific denominations. A lot
Yeah.
of people who message me are like, "Oh, I love Christianity. I love all this stuff. I listen to Jonathan Peugeot or whatever, and I love your channel, but I don't go to church because I don't think I personally need to." And some of them, the ones that get me the most, people who are like, "I think other people should go to church, but personally, like, you don't understand my situation." I got multiple messages that way where they think of themselves as the exception. And I would say you actually have no grounds for assurance. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you're definitely damned, but you have no grounds for assurance if you
I
do
know.
not regularly attend church, because the word justification is used both to talk about your relationship with God, whether or not you're justified in the eyes of God, but also whether or not you're justified before the community. Like, are you here? Or do we respect you?
What the Reformed
And
scholastics say is, regarding the sacraments and their relation to salvation, it's not the want, but the rejection of sacraments that condemns you.
yeah,
So if for whatever
Richard Hooker
reason,
says that exact phrase. He says the exact same thing. So Anglicans agree. Yeah.
um, so if for whatever reason you cannot get baptized, you want to get baptized, you die before you can, or if you want to attend church but you can't, that's fine. But if you are not regularly receiving communion or trying to,
Yeah.
your salvation is very questionable. And I, as an outsider, have no grounds to assume you are a Christian. So I believe the Reformed tradition has a strong emphasis on God's freedom. God can spontaneously regenerate a random, uncontacted tribes person. That person never even assents to any Christian doctrine. They can just be spontaneously regenerated, right? God can, as Karl Barth said, God can reveal the word of God to us by means of a sunset, a flute concerto, or a dead dog. But
Mm-hmm.
the ordinary means of grace means you can't have assurance of salvation without them. You can't have assurance of salvation if
Yeah.
you do not attend church every week. That you can. There's exceptions, but the exceptions don't define the rule. The rule should be you attend church every week. The exception is when you can't or you're sick. But if you don't do that and you're not partaking of the sacraments regularly as often as your church does it, you can't have assurance of salvation.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's Richard Hooker in book 5 of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Politics. He talks about this, and he talks about his example of somebody who can't go to church on Sunday and receive communion is someone who's a prisoner of war, and like that is stopped. And he talks about like, yes, that guy who's praying on Sunday in his jail cell or whatever it is, is better off than the person who vainly attends church on Sunday, doesn't mean it. But the ideal is somebody who attends church on Sunday and does mean it. He's in some way in a the best possible scenario. That is still the best possible scenario. There's no reason somebody shouldn't. He even talks about sick people should still be in contact with their priest so that the priest can bring them communion into their house. Or the curate will bring sick people, whatever.
I would say that's a bit too far. You don't want to get your priest sick. Like
yes.
as a Calvinist, I don't think the sacraments are like magic where it's like, I think if you truly have the intention to partake, that is as good as partaking. But there's never a case in which someone will truly have the intention, have the ability, and not do it.
Yeah. To be clear, Richard Hooker actually agrees with that. He says there are people like he says in Moses and all those people in the desert, they did actually truly feast on Christ spiritually. Like, St. Paul's thing where like that rock was Christ and the water was Christ and they fed on Christ's spiritual food. He just thinks that the bar for like you cannot take is a lot higher, I would say, than we would say today. Is my only point. Like that they really did affirm, even though they believed in this hypothetical, partaking without actually going, that they would still emphasize that you actually have to make like a serious effort to regularly go to church.
And I'm not sure what your view of this is, but I believe that going to church is one of the 10 commandments, the fourth commandment of obeying the Sabbath. Do you think the Sabbath is real, or do you think God changed his mind about it?
So when I first was getting into Anglican theology, the position that I heard as the Anglican position, and you maybe I think have talked about this before, was the idea that the Saturday is still the Sabbath, but that the Lord's Day is the day that we congregate. And so the Sabbath is still the day of rest and Saturday, yada, yada, yada. But when I read the early Anglican reformers, like Davenant, I think explicitly says that it is now Sunday is the Sabbath. So
Anglican history is just watching the Anglican Church slowly transform from Presbyterian into Catholic.
Richard Hooker, I think, does, and he's before John Davenant. He does do the whole Saturday is still the Sabbath. So it's just more mixed, I would say, in Anglican history.
I know. I will say Augustine is wrong about this. Augustine disagrees with us. He says that he literally explicitly says 9 out of the 10 commandments still apply to us. Mm-hmm. But like, bruh, that makes no that makes no sense. Now I don't buy the whole Lord's Day and Sabbath are different days, because the meaning of Sabbath is the day that is dedicated to the Lord. The day dedicated to the Lord on which you congregate. And the New Testament says the day dedicated to the Lord on which they congregated was Sunday. So
you could say that the seventh day is still the day of rest. Because I think that the theologians who harp on that is that if you just read the Genesis story, it seems like the seventh day is the day of rest. And then the Lord's Day, because I'm going to forget who said this, but the one Anglican theologian who I had read about this, it might be N.T. Wright, is that it's actually symbolically significant that the Lord's Day is not a day of rest. Like, it's actually an active day where we're preaching. Like, you can see in Acts where it talks about them congregating on the first day of the week. They're also evangelizing and like doing things that would have been Sabbath breaking in like the Old Testament. I think it's N.T. Wright. I could be totally wrong about that, but so I think it is kind of like, I don't know. I haven't made my mind up, if I'm being honest.
I'm just saying, I don't care what your take on this is, because you're not part of the one true Presbyterian church. But I would say Presbyterians have a much easier grounds to say you have to go to church, because the other thing is, it's good to have fellowship. You need the sacraments. You need to be part of a community. We just say it's the fourth commandment. Do it.
Yeah. We got a super chat from Jongswa. Thanks for the $5. Apparently, it's an extremely important question for Redeem Zoomer. What's your favorite Bach suite? Mine's French Suite number 4.
Orchestral Suite number 1, the first movement of that.
Yeah.
If we're counting orchestral suites. I also the cello suites are okay, and I play them on viola, but I just never liked solo music. I think it's the idea of multiple voices singing together is always more objectively beautiful than solo voices. That's why like choirs of angels are so beautiful in the Bible. And that's why hymn music with multiple voices is objectively more beautiful than CCM with one voice and just a guitar accompaniment.
Agreed. Actually, one of the things that I think is so important about participatory Christianity is singing all these old hymns that people have sung for generations. And a difference I've noticed between contemporary music and older hymns is older hymns are actually made to be sung by people who can't sing that well. If that makes sense. Like they have a smaller range, and there's usually, like, if you open up an old hymnal, there's like the people who have a higher voice notes and people who have a lower voice notes and how to sing it. And they just sound better when there's lots of people singing them than contemporary music, where you can't hear everyone else singing with you over like the drums and the guitar and everything else that's going on. And the like vocal fry singer at the front of the, the room. And I've noticed that contemporary music services tend to have one person on the mic versus traditional worship services. They have a choir. It's still multiple people that are teaching you, that are kind of leading the singing.
I just got to say, I just saw a notification. I got a message earlier. Someone told me another example. Someone said they were struggling with a specific sin. Every male can figure out which sin this is. And they felt like they weren't saved. They couldn't quit it. And I had asked this person, you go to church weekly? I got the answer just now. The answer is no.
That's what it is.
So the participatory aspect is you're going to fall into sin if you're not in church every week. You will.
Yeah. If you don't I've noticed in my life, if I don't take communion, like if I have a week that I couldn't go, I didn't take communion, it's just a harder week. It's just rough. All I was going to say about the choirs is that when we see the heavenly worship, it is about, you're right, the voices of all these people singing together.
The heavenly worship is a choir.
Yeah.
You can be a Bible-believing Baptist biblicist, alliteration there, and still say choirs are more biblical than a single soloist in skinny jeans with like a guitar in the background.
Yeah. I'm going to quickly answer to the super chats. First one is $2. Should Christians vote for presidential election? The answer is if they want to.
The answer from the RPCNA is no, because our nation isn't explicitly in covenant with Christ.
Do they actually tell you not to vote in the RPCNA?
They used to. I'm not sure if they still do, but that was a big thing. They said the nation is not in covenant with Christ like it should be. So no.
Interesting. Thanks for the $2 euro or pounds, I think. Bradford C. Walsbury. Is low church music spiritually dangerous?
Yes. It comes from the charismatics, Jesus people, hippie revival movements. It is.
I actually, depending on the context, I'd probably actually agree. We're getting suddenly a bunch of super chats. If you have to go,
IFBs are right about this. IFBs are also right about rap music.
Yeah.
There's a lot of random things I think the IFBs are actually right about, and like mental health is one of them. I just opened a whole new can of worms, but you don't have to agree with me on that. But the IFBs are right about CCM. They're actually very strict about avoiding CCM and only singing hymns, and they're right about that.
Yeah, which is again the theme of the video. The problem with contemporary worship, in my opinion, is actually it's like the culture. So what people a lot of times want in these evangelical churches is they know that it's going to be propositionally difficult to be Christian. So they want to blend in as much as possible and it be as inoffensive in all these other ways. But the problem, in my opinion, is that if it looks like the culture for all these other reasons, it will casually imbibe assumptions that the culture makes that are not Christian, that are even antithetical to Christianity. And it's only at the times when all these older hymns were written and all of this stuff was composed, when the entire culture was already Christian. Yes, people will be like, oh, but they were adapting contemporary music from their time. Yeah, but their contemporary culture was much more Christian than our contemporary culture is. So it just isn't the same. It's not equivalent. It's like if somebody turned like a Muslim, I don't know if they have music, but like if they turned something from a different religion into a Christian worship music, it would just be like, or like if they took a Mormon hymn and started singing that in church.
Yeah. Any more super chats? It's important.
Yeah, we get a couple more. Thank you for the $5 from Thomas Cranberry again. How do I convince my older family members that young people do like tradition? It's just true. I don't know.
I'd say it never matters what old people think because the young people always win anyway. So I'd say you don't need to convince them. Just keep doing your thing and stay in the Episcopal Church because it's based.
$2 from American Prod. Thank you again. I hate Protestia. What do you think about them? I think they're like a Twitter.
Well, they just represent like the Catholic strawman of Protestantism. I'm not going to say I hate a brother. Seriously, Jesus said you're in danger of hell if you say that. But look, they often pick the wrong things to fight with Catholics about, like whether Mary is a perpetual virgin. It's really weird how some Protestants really insist Mary had other children and was not a virgin. Okay, no.
And it's like when you're not actually reading it's such a distraction too. I actually think it almost benefits Roman Catholics to focus on that stuff, because then you read like Heinrich Bullinger or Richard Hooker literally has a conversation where he says it does not matter if Mary was a perpetual virgin, and he admits that many people at the time believed in Mary's perpetual virginity, even though he says he doesn't believe in it. But he has his reasons why, yada yada yada. But then you start to say, oh wait, actually, if this is the reason I'm not Roman Catholic, it's way easier to defeat that argument than it is to defeat the argument for, say, in my opinion, sola fide, because the Bible is very clear about sola fide.
Or like a lot of evangelicals don't care about like icon veneration, and like a lot of the Jesus Storybook Bible or whatever. Like that is the strongest case against Catholicism and Orthodoxy, because even Roman Catholic apologists, not even scholars, apologists, admit the early church didn't venerate icons. It's only Eastern Orthodox apologists, not their scholars, apologists, who will claim the early church venerated icons.
Yeah. And it is funny too, because it's like the self-defeating thing. If in theory, in a weird way, I think if, say, some Protestant denomination started venerating icons and used all the arguments that John Chrysostom makes, if you read his defense of, not John Chrysostom, John of Damascus makes in his defense of it, it's all pure Bible. Like, he does not cite church fathers. He doesn't make an argument from tradition. He doesn't make an argument from history, right? In theory, it makes more sense qua Protestantism than it does qua the traditionalist, denominations or whatever. But all right. Thank you so much for coming on. If you got to go, you got to go. We've been streaming for 2 hours, so I think it's been long enough. And you guys have all had your opportunities to super chat and ask questions. Half of them were barely questions. But thanks so much for coming on, Redeem Zoomer. Thanks so much, everyone, for chatting.
All right, see ya.
See ya.